Thank you for joining us. I am Dasha Matsura. I am the director here at Hashimoto Contemporary San Francisco, and I'm really excited that we get to do this special talk in conjunction with the Eight Bridges San Francisco Art Week celebration. Looks a little different this year, as most things have for the last 13 months, eternity. So this exhibition features Joel Daniel Phillips, who we'll be hearing more from later tonight, and Ana Valdez, Christopher Martin, and Jeffrey Chung for the exhibition. The chat window in the side panel there will be active, so if you have any questions for any of our panelists, feel free to put them there. We'll also be sharing some links. It looks like Joel already has shared one there, but I'll share a couple of other links for the exhibition, more information about our artists, and yeah, so let's go. So we're going to be joined tonight by Scott Stuhlin, the director and president of the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In addition to leading the Philbrook Museum, Scott is a visual artist, writer, and DJ. He was also the curator of audience experiences and performance at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, joining the Philbrook in 2016. Previously, at the Walker Art Center, he produced the Internet Cat Video Festival, which, if you're not familiar with, I highly encourage you taking a look. It became a viral sensation online and has toured in 250 cities and 13 countries around the world. Scott has an MFA in painting and drawing from the University of Minnesota and a BFA in sculpture from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Also joining us is Quraish Ali Lonsana. Quraish is an American poet, book editor, civil rights historian, and professor. Lonsana is the author of 8 books of poetry in addition to textbooks and works for children. His most recent book, Opal's Greenwood Oasis, is a children's book about a young African-American woman living in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, just prior to the 1921 race massacre. The book is brand new and will be hitting bookstores in just a few days. In addition to his own writing and editorial work, Quraish is a former faculty member of both the writing program of the Art Institute of Chicago and the drama division of the Juilliard School. He's also served as the director of the Gwendolyn Brooks Center for Black Literature and Creative Writing at Chicago State University and was an associate professor of English and creative writing. He's currently a Tulsa Artist Fellow, where he met Joel. Joel is also one of our long-standing members of the Hashimoto Contemporary family, and we are so pleased to exhibit this new body of work. He's exhibited nationally and abroad, including the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, the Philbrook Museum of Art, the Fort Wayne Museum of Art, the Auckland Art Museum, among many others. He is currently a fellow at the Tulsa Artist Fellowship in Oklahoma, where he met Scott and Quraish. And with that, I'll let Scott take over.
Thank you so much. I am honored to lead this conversation with 2 of my favorite people and also brilliant artists. So I feel really lucky to be able to have this conversation tonight. And thank you to everybody that is joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I think everybody knows how Zoom works at this point, I should hope. And so if you have any questions or comments or things, just add them into the chat as we go along. We'll try to work those into our conversation as we go tonight. The format is that we're going to start off with Joel doing a little introduction to the work for those that may not be as familiar, and it'll kind of start us off there. And then we're going to have a poem, and then we will kind of go into a Q&A, and then we're going to close it with another poem at the end. So it'll be kind of our format for this evening. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Joel to start and give us a little bit of an introduction to this body of work, some of its influences, and kind of set the groundwork, I think, for the conversation this evening.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in. Let me see, I'm not muted, good. So Killing the Negative is a body of work that started when I stumbled on an image in an archive. Most of my work is about responding to archived historical material through my pencil and a piece of charcoal. And I spend a lot of time looking through historical archives, and I was on a photo blog and I stumbled on a photograph by Walker Evans that had a big black circle in the middle of it, and I immediately stopped, and I thought that maybe it was a Baldessari sort of knockoff, or somebody had done something in the contemporary realm with this old historical photograph. And then I realized that it was a hole punch in the middle of this negative, and that took me down this rabbit hole of researching and diving into the history of the Farm Security Administration's photographs of the Great Depression. Most folks know about these images. I'm sure everyone here has seen these images, even if you don't know where they're from. The image by Dorothea Lange, the migrant mother, is probably the penultimate image of the Great Depression. It's the image that comes to mind when we think about that time period. And it was commissioned by the federal government as part of a program where they were trying out all sorts of things, but part of the program was called the Farm Security Administration, and there was a photographic arm of that. And the idea was that they were trying to show America to Americans, and they would send out photographers such as Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Russell Lee, many, many names that have now become US photographic canon, into these sites around the country where they had programs, and ask these photographers to try to capture what was happening. And then these photographers would send these images back, and they became part of this massive documentarian, we'll get into that in a bit, process. And so lots of folks know about these images. They're very much part of our canon. What a lot of folks don't know is the way that one man, a gentleman by the name of Roy Stryker, how he had the power to shape that narrative. He was the head of the FSA. And for the first 3 to 5 years of the project, it's sort of a nebulous timeline. Any photos that he didn't like, he would hole punch. So that's sort of the historical backdrop. This body of work came out of that, and is me responding with my pencil to these censored images from the government's commissioned photographs of the Great Depression.
Thanks, Joel. We're going to get a little bit more in a little more depth some of the source material, and obviously kind of what you're doing with that material here shortly. Before we do that, though, I want Q to actually share the poem that is in the Joel actually shared the PDF that's here, but it's in the small printed publication. But a good way of kicking us off, and just kind of setting the tone for the conversation, and then we'll go into our back and forth from there.
Well, I would love for everyone to open up the image so you see the image to which I am responding in verse, which is Killed Negative number 13 after author Rothstein. So you have a sense of sort of the source of these words. The poem is called Hospitality. What rain must come for a black man to wet? What sound makes us fall? The deep rivers of my hands, dry creeks my forehead, to Arkansas heat I long to forget. Seed won't take to tears, I beg heaven to weep. New life in scent of sky, sobs on musty earth. We are drought and flood, thunder and drench, downpour and light. My knees callous dirt as my eyes to the stranger. Blessing in my blood, dressed in wisdom, not my own, but not yours. I am this moment, this life. Who are you to pause my sun up with your whiteness and picture box? To demand stillness in a land that little rewards idle? You offer no food for my grandsons' mouths, no shelter from raging wind. Every day the sun is angry. This coat tired as my hope, starving little ones on my brow. Harvest, a dream buried in dust. Good day, sir.
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I want to talk more about that in relation to the image of the book in here in a moment. We'll get to that, but thank you for starting us off, Q. That was beautiful. We'll kind of bookend our conversation with the pieces of prose tonight. So Joel, kind of coming back to how you started with the introduction, and I'm not sure you wanted to say, how did you come across this archive? So how did this come on your radar so that you kind of found it? And then also kind of where is it located right now? Is it something that other people could look through if they wanted to?
Yeah, so when I first stumbled on the image, it was luckily credited directly to the Library of Congress, which is where these photographs live. They are owned by the American people as being commissioned by the government, and these original negatives are in the Library of Congress's collection in Washington, D.C. And only recently they've gone through a series of reorganizations and digitizing over the years. There's 170,000 photographs in the entire body of work, so there's a significant amount. But the images that were censored were only recently digitized, and so they I don't know how they found them. They must have found boxes of hole punched images, and you can sort of see how they pieced them back into the archive. But long story short, they're on the Library of Congress's website. I believe it's loc.gov in their photo collection, and you can go through and look image by image in each roll, and you can actually, if you search for the term hole punch in the collection of FSA photographs, you can see all 5,000 some hole punched images that were censored. So.
And they're high resolution scans, correct?
They are So
downloadable too.
They are downloadable at I think it's like a 30 megabyte TIFF, which made the artist in me like when I first dove into the archive, the question was, is there information here for me to respond from? And the fact that I had that at my fingertips was really incredible, especially considering that it was a marred document. It was really amazing.
And so you were looking through it, you kind of became aware of these images and then started, looking through them, and assuming kind of gradually did some more research about Roy Stryker and kind of how the cancellation of these images, how these came to be, and kind of how they've been kind of, edited out of this narrative.
Yeah.
And so with that, just a little bit more about that. So in that early 4-year process where kind of the hole punch process was happening, do you know of a criteria that he was using other than his own kind of just eye in that? Was there anything else that was being used there, or was it one person really deciding what was in and what was out?
It was just him. I mean, so yeah, it's interesting because the first question that popped into my mind is obviously, why would he censor these? That's sort of the question at the center of all of this is why? What is his criteria for making these decisions? And you very quickly find when you start to look at these images that it wasn't just images with physical flaws. It was images that I believe, as I've gone through the censored ones, they're images that should be in our photographic lexicon alongside the migrant mother photograph. But they were hole punched. And that sort of immediately begs a question of why these images that were so powerful were not part of the published images. And the photographers themselves actually hated the process. There are a couple of documents, there's very little about it. And Roy Stryker was very closed-mouthed about why he did that, but there's a letter from Arthur Rothstein, one of the photographers, to Roy Stryker, where he complains about the images being hole punched because he's ruining his work. And obviously at the time, it wasn't as if he was just getting rid of a copy of it. It was the only image. It was an erasure of the actual history that was happening. So yeah, I can talk a bit, but I feel like I'm meandering a bit. I actually went out to the Library of Congress to ask that question. Joy Harjo, who we'll talk a bit about, is a friend of Q and mine. She was kind enough, she's a US Poet Laureate, she was kind enough to make an introduction to Beverly Brand, who's the head of the collection at the Library of Congress. And so I got to go out and visit and talk to them about this whole thing. And they were actually, it was interesting, they were a bit territorial about the question. When I came in and I said, hey, why were these censored? And I immediately, my first conclusion was one of, these are censored based off of race and class, and sort of the larger narrative was one of white people are very preeminent within these images. And Beverly Brandon was sort of like, yeah, everybody tries to say that, and we don't know if that's true. It was an interesting conversation that she sort of pushed back and tried to make the argument that they were only censored as a organizational principle because there were so many images. I don't buy that personally because of the power of some of the images that were censored. And there are also documents that sort of show Roy Stryker's overt racism, particularly towards Native people. But yeah, that's getting a bit far afield. So
Well, I think it speaks actually right to some of the core of it, though, too. And you referenced that in your essay of kind of things that he definitely was saying that he had bias and was very open about that. And maybe not even aware about how open he was about that, but it definitely is there within the work. And I think, the one that you also referenced in the essay is that the purpose of this work was to introduce America to Americans. So it really was about a certain education or propaganda or storytelling or myth making. And in doing that, if there is a certain story you want to tell, that can be a way that you're organizing, editing, and canceling those images going forward. We're obviously connecting a lot of those dots there, but I don't think it's that hard, personally, it's that hard to do that. Now, what I do think that was interesting in this is that using such a destructive method to do it, and where you could have put a dot on them, you could have marked the outside of the negative, there could have been other ways of doing it, but that true cancellation of it, the ruining of the image, and so often, as you see in there, it's right in the middle, it isn't in the corner. It is truly with an intention of destroying that negative. And did you ever find anything specifically about why the punch was used for that?
I didn't. I did, so I've gone through the whole edited section of the collection back and forth several times at this point, and it seems like at one point he was using a China marker instead of a hole punch, and then he went back to using a hole punch. As far as why that was this weapon of choice, and sort of, I do think it is a sort of violent act. As far as why that was, I think it was a permanency, and I think it was a control question. I really do believe that is true. And whether or not he was wielding it for particularly nefarious reasons, it was a weapon. And that's sort of the conversation that I started with, was this idea of shaping the narrative and how within this body of work, like you said, this was touted to Americans as a documentarian thing. This was showing America to Americans, is what they said. And yet the reality of it was that there was one man in a dark room who was deciding what America was. And for me, that felt like a metaphor for all of America, that there was one white man in the room deciding what the narrative should be and how that should be talked about. And that it just felt almost too poignant to even wrap my head around in the midst of the last 4 years of what we've been talking about nationally.
Yeah, and if I may jump in, if you don't mind,
please, Q. Yes.
I mean, that's because he set me up, right? That's a part of what drove the motivation for the work that I've written, right? That I wrote both these poems in a kind of persona, right? Giving voice and agency to the lives of the Black man in hospitality and the young Black boy you will meet from the second poem, because they didn't have a voice then, right? And the part of where I know you're going to end up going, Scott, right, we're going to talk about is, again, that idea of agency, that idea of who has a voice, who controls whose narrative. Do you control your own narrative? Right. And that's why that was a part of the motivation to give these entities, to give these men voice, agency, presence, right? In a country, and specifically in states, right, of this country, where there was a very active commitment to denying their own existence, denying their own voice, denying their own agency, if not outright destroying it. And it's a very important part of the work that I've written in relationship to these images.
Thanks, Q. I'm glad you jumped in with that. I think that's very important and part of this. And I would even add, to this is that not only is it a white male in that era, it's somebody who is working in the US government with that authority on top of it, and then working in photography, which still at that point had a certain air of truth to it, which maybe doesn't now, but very much did that. We'll come around to that a little bit and bringing this into the present. So moving into your work, Joel, so you came across this archive, you saw this work, really are thinking about, these images are just loaded with issues of race and class and representation, how histories are written, who has the power, who doesn't, labor. And there's so many things about this that feel even more present to this moment that I want to get into. But to start, it's like, so you're looking through this and kind of how did the process go, like how you were going to take this into your work and kind of translate it. And, I think everybody here knows that you work in these large format, photorealistic drawing processes with it. But it could have just as easily say, I'm going to take these photographs and make other photographs of them and use them. So what was the process of saying, I'm going to take these and I'm going to go through this slow process of translating, in some cases enlarging them and turning them into these painstaking drawings?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, that sort of gets at the heart of a question I often ask myself, which is what's the point of me spending all of this time? And I wrestle with that a lot, to be totally blunt. But for me, the process of drawing is one that's primarily about observation. And I as an artist and as an individual, see best when I draw. And so for me, there's a part of the process that's about my own understanding of what I'm looking at. And that is one of seeing through the tip of my pencil. That it forces me to observe in a way that I think is really unparalleled. But as far as the images and their existence for an audience, I think it was about adding an extra layer of possible change and shifting to the narrative. I was very aware from the beginning that I was yet another white man who is responding to these. And I wanted to create a dialogue about that, because when somebody walks into a room, there's sort of a staggered experience they have with my work, or at least I hope they have if I did it well, which is you walk in and from far away, you think you're looking at a photograph. And then as you get closer, you realize you're not. And then with these images and all of my historical archive work, you get closer yet and you realize this is a drawing from a archival historical moment. And that sort of question that is created by sort of layering that invention, final layer of intervention and invention on top of the archival moment, where the viewer can never know if my response to this image is truthful. And it sort of forces them to question in one kind of final way the truthfulness of the image itself, because I could have invented it. And no one will ever know if I did or not. I mean, the viewers are welcome to go to the Library of Congress and go and look at the images side by side. I think it's actually a really interesting exercise to do that. But I do my best to not change things. I see this as almost a archival and documentarian process, even though I'm doing it in a way that's very much not that. And I'm interested as an artist in these conversations, not only of narrative and how those stories are told, but the mechanisms by which we tell them and how they're truthful or not, or how we see them societally as being truthful or not. Where photographs in this era were seen as being truthful for the people who consumed them. And the reality is that narrative was being shaped. It was not necessarily truthful. And we're now living, ironically enough, in a moment where we don't see photographs as truthful any longer. But when I take an anachronistic process like drawing and I apply it to a photograph, it sort of shifts it back into the space of, I want to spend time with this. It must be truthful. It must be worth looking at. It must be, because this guy spent 350 hours drawing it. Of course, it's worth something. And so, yeah, it's that layering process of sort of adding on this final lens that twists it just enough to bring it back around to be different. At least I hope that's what it does.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting choice, doing that, because it is such a painstaking process. And I know we've talked too that at times you've felt that tension of whether you should edit something or not. an image, and you've held very true. Can you speak to that a little bit, of just some moments, maybe just one example of that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, gosh, this one was actually really hard. There was a drawing. I don't know if it's in the PDF or not. I think it might be, of that I was making this summer. It was a large portrait of a man who looked like a farmer. He was wearing suspenders and had this kind of floppy cap on. And I got 3/4 of the way through the drawing down to his belt line, because I draw from the top left to the bottom right. And his suspenders said police on them. And this was right after George Floyd was murdered. And I really wrestled with whether I wanted that to be part of the image, because I didn't want it to be there. I had this emotional gut response. I did not want that to be part of this image. And I ended up keeping it. I don't feel like my place is to change that. And I feel like it added something to the work. But I really struggled with that in that moment, because my gut emotional response was like, no, I don't want, this is a conversation that's related and certainly connected, but I didn't want it to be pulled into this other space. And also, I just didn't want the word police in it. It made me angry. And so I ended up keeping it. But yeah, it's tough with each image, because I have this need to add my own spin. There's sort of this constant reining in of my own changing to the image in this process that is a bit Sisyphean, to be honest. It's a very sort of it's a very frustrating process that sort of I'm trying to stay true to something while I can't stay true to it, and I also have to keep myself from adding to it. And it's interesting that we never really talked about how Q and I got connected around the work. I see my role in this body of work as almost, as I mentioned earlier, attempted archivist, even though I know it's a failing process. And I wanted to bring in someone else who would add the actual creation to it. There's an element of like invention that I felt like it wasn't my role to bring to this particular body of work, that someone else needed to do. There's this vacuum at the center of it, this missing story. And that didn't feel like it was my role with this series. That my role was this sort of, hey, look at what we're seeing here, kind of, I don't even know if that's a passing through almost. I kind of hate it when artists talk about being that sort of, it came through me and it wasn't really me, it was some outside. But I do feel that way about this work. And I feel like there's an element that was deeply missing because of that sort of holding myself in that space, which was why when I first started this, I brought Q into my studio and I said, what do you think of this? Do you think there are words that could come in response to these images? And immediately, Q, you can talk about that response.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. I mean, I think, again, that a part of what you're saying, I mean, my mentor was Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, the first Black person to ever receive the Pulitzer Prize. And one of my favorite quotes of the many that she put into the world and that she shared with me, right, is that if she ever needed to find a poem, all she had to do was look out of her window, right? That a part of our work as artists is about the power of observation, right? The power of seeing. And we see with different elements of our humanity. We see with our eyes, but we also see with our ears, our fingertips, our kneecaps, our hearts, our brains, our intuitions, right? And so a part of it is, for me, right, the attraction to the work, besides the fact that, the subject matter is amazing and Joel is a brilliant draftsman in terms of rendering that work, is the idea in the power of observation. I'm a journalist as well. And there's a journalistic aspect of Joel's work. There's a journalistic aspect of these photographs, although that journalistic aspect is compromised. It's tainted in a way. And I think that the fact that it's tainted, the space that those stains allow for the gray area for Joel to be truthful and authentic to the reproduction, but also in that space question, right, why they are what they are. You know what I mean? Not only the decisions that the individual photographers made, that I'm going to stop this man in Arkansas who is skin to bone. You know, his coat is heavy and wrinkled. He's heavy on his brow, but he has a top hat on, a bowler hat on, and he's stooping to a white man to say, "Good day, sir." Right? And that I would try and get into this man's head in the moments that I imagine he might have experienced, he might have thought about prior to just the reaction of, why is this white man on my yard? Why is this white man on my property? Who is this white man and why you got this camera, right? Why is he here? Right? And then also in the latter poem, which you'll hear momentarily, thinking about, I'm just a young Black boy trying to sell pecans to make some money to earn supper, right? In Alma, Georgia, where anyone who didn't have 100 acres of land got forced to sell their land for northern paper companies who came up, who wanted the pine to make paper. Therefore, they were forced out between the northern companies who wanted the land for the pine to make paper, to the wild Razorbacks, to the true story of the Black man who was turned into a horned goat, right? A Negro goat by a doctor in Alma, right? And taken out as a sideshow sort of exhibition. All of it, right, plays on the idea that Joel has been wrestling with from the moment that he found these images, which is, who gets to control the narrative and whose stories are authentic? And do I have the right, right? Do I possess the right to authentically, or at least attempted authenticity, replicate or share stories? Am I honoring them in the ways in which they were intended to manifest in the world? Right? And that's part of why I love this project and why I love Joel, why I love you, Scott, is about that idea, right? That intersectionality of authenticity, storytelling, and truth, right? As ugly as it can be and as ugly as it often is, there's also a beauty in that. And our histories are so intertwined that there's no way that we can, I mean, unless you just don't want to understand the relationship between our histories for your own good or your own desire to storm the Capitol, right? then you're just not paying attention to what's real, right? And I think that's a part of what I love about this project. So I'll stop now.
No, that was very, go ahead, Joel, go
Well,
ahead.
I say that reminded me, Hugh, of when we looked at the two images. I don't remember if I sent them to you, if we were in my studio, but my brain is telling me that we were in my studio looking at the images of the first poem that you wrote in response to Killed -13, the one you read at the beginning of this this talk. There were two images of that gentleman, and the one that was published was a one where he was looking down and he wasn't making eye contact, and the one that wasn't published was the one where he was making eye contact with the photographer. And that for me felt like it sort of created the entire direction for this conversation, this project. Was like, I couldn't, as much as the Library of Congress folks wanted to say this wasn't what was happening, I couldn't look at that image as a portraitist and not see the agency being removed from that individual, and see him seeing that in that image. There's an anger to his gaze that you can read in the, I hope in my portrait, but in the photograph, absolutely. That is a sort of a righteous anger.
No, well said. No, absolutely. Well said. And you did, it was in your studio and you did have both images up. And, you know, I was struck again by the power in both of the images, but the idea that a Black man in 1939 or 37 would actually look a white man in the eye with what he was struggling with trying to feed his family, with trying to work this land that was parched earth. And this stranger rolls up with this picture box, and that based on based on the photograph and based on how you rendered the gentleman, right? His age, his character, his station, the way he presented himself in the image, there was no way that this man was nothing short of dignified, even in his own box of how a black man can be dignified in Jim Crow America in Arkansas in the 30s, right? That there was no way that this man could be nothing but would present himself to others as someone with some degree of dignity. And so that's why all of the poem is all internal until we get to Good Day, Sir, because this is what I'm going to say to you, white man. I'm going to say, good day, sir. But what I'm running in my head is, why are you up in my property? Why are you here? What you want? You see I'm struggling, right? What is it that you want from me? You're keeping me from my work, And a part of that, again, that has everything to do with how you interpreted the images. It has everything to do with that, nephew, and I need you to hear that. The negatives are the negatives. The images are the images. And the images, the actual images are journalism in a way. There's no art. There's very little art in my mind involved in. I mean, nobody set up like, here, I'm going to set up this picture aesthetically. They took the picture and then they moved on. What you've done is that you've established an aesthetic narrative, an aesthetic depth to these images that were killed by recreating them, but also in the recreation, you reinvigorate the story. You reinvigorate their lives. You create agency and add agency to these moments. And that's what spoke to me. I could have looked at these images on the Library of Congress and been like, that's messed up. But to look at your renderings, your drafting of these images, it's like, this is something so much more than just being messed up, right? And that's what grabbed hold of me, right? So, all right, I'm stopped now.
I think that's really well, both of you, and that's great. That gets at so much of what I wanted to kind of address. Is I think that there's first of all, I'm glad you brought the journalism piece, Q, because I think that's when I'm thinking about your prose with the image. To me, it acts like that. It is like photojournalism with the story. And how do we bring those back? And this process that you're doing is in a way that there was this truth that was there originally with the actual subject that was photographed, that was there, that was somewhat taken away by put in this context, and that through this photograph that was canceled. And you're trying, Jill, to pull some of it back, to bring a little bit of truth, a little bit back to it, and knowing that you can't retrieve all of it, but you might be able to pull a little bit more of it back into this different context. And it's very much about the present. And I want to talk a bit about kind of how this is operating in the present, because I think it's really hard to look at these and not, yes, there is that kind of layer of this history that's there. Yes, we understand they're of a certain era, but particularly in the last year. And I know you've been working on this before pandemic time, but now that we've moved into a year, not only of a global pandemic, but of all of the racial division and reckoning that we're going through right now, dealing with all the economic turmoil, everything that we're dealing with, these images take on a whole different context. When you have people standing in a soup line or looking at a job board that's here, or standing with everything they own on their body, it's hard to remove that from this moment. So I'm just curious for both of you, is that, has this body work changed a bit in the moment that we are now? And even when you've been thinking about images that you're selecting and the ones that you're bringing forward, because I know this is an ongoing body. And Q, I'd be curious your thoughts on that as well.
Q, do you want to take this? Start with this
I
one,
was
or
going to
should I?
send it to you, nephew.
All right, I'll dive in. So funny enough, I feel like there's layers to this from my own personal experience with this work. Prior to coming to Oklahoma for the Tulsa Artist Fellowship, my work was these life-size portraits. I was working from living, breathing people. It was not archival material. And the reason I shifted gears and dove into this body of work and others in response to archives was actually the Trump election. And in 2016, we were actually driving, my fiance and I were driving from California to Oklahoma on this sort of reverse Grapes of Wrath tour as Trump was being inaugurated. And I started thinking a lot about the phrase "Make America Great Again" and how it is a vast erasure of historical reality for many, many people's experiences, because it's this nostalgified sort of Norman Rockwell conjuring of what America used to be, rather than a real understanding of the complexity of that narrative. And it's sort of it sort of says like, look how great things were, and we need to go back to that. And there's so many layers of how problematic that is, but it in my head, I realized the need to respond to that from a historical standpoint, to dive into the complexity of those narratives, because obviously 50% of America looked at the Jim Crow era and thought that was great, and they look back on it now and think it was great. And
just 50? Are you sure it was just 50?
We're talking about the Trump vote and the phrase "Make America Great Again," and it's sort of whitewashing of.
Again, are you sure it was just 50? Okay.
That for me was sort of the root of all of this, was thinking about how these historical narratives are now in the contemporary conversation being twisted, and people's understanding of what America was not what America was. And trying to understand, as an artist and as an amateur historian that I am, how does that massive shift happen? And I know that in the moment, dichotomy between how people perceived America in that time period, but looking back in a theoretically, at least according to some Americans, a post-racial space or something. I mean, it's people think that certain people seem to think that this is not worth talking about because we're past it. But people don't understand the complexity of that history, and I wanted to have a conversation about that complexity in the midst of this moment. And so, as this kind of endless 4 years of Trumpian nightmare progressed, I feel like it continually came back around to itself in a way that I didn't want it to. I wanted to be able to ignore it. I wanted to be able to say this isn't happening, and I couldn't. And it kept coming back to the fore. It kept coming back to the center of my own consciousness, and that very much shaped this work. For me, it was sort of the realization of this vast need within our own American understanding of who we are, this giant echoing void in how much of our history we don't know and we don't talk about and we skip right over. And that even just carving off a little bit of a slice and talking about that and saying, hey, maybe there's a common thirst for this conversation, at least we're both sides of this conversation are perhaps interested in this moment as an era. We're both seem to be focused on it. Maybe we can talk about what it was, a little bit of what it really was, for the people who were erased out of that moment and for the complexities of that moment. And that was sort of what pulled in for me. And then the pandemic happened, and I remember at the beginning of that, I was just diving into this solo show that was sort of the first main series of this, and it was suddenly like, oh, well, on top of everything else, we also have another Great Depression happening, and that added this kind of ridiculously apt layer on top that, and one little sort of tangential tidbit that I keep coming back to in my own head was in the moment of the Great Depression, when these images were shot, what Roy Stryker and what his bosses talked about was this idea of showing America to Americans. And the reason they talked about that was because there was this giant giant divide between rich folks on the coasts and people in the middle of America at that moment. And their experiences of what the Great Depression was were actually, from a percentage standpoint, fairly similar to our own experiences of COVID, which is that people who had good jobs were actually pretty much fine. And yes, there were bankers who lost their jobs, and you hear these stories of people jumping off of skyscrapers, but by and large, there was something like 60% of America that operated normally throughout the Great Depression. And that was not something that I knew prior to diving into this body of work, and that resonated really deeply with this work as a whole, was thinking about this moment and realizing how our own understanding of it was one that sort of said, oh, everyone experienced this equally. We were all screwed. And that was not true. It was only some people who were screwed and other people who weren't. And that sort of divide down the middle of America felt like it connected deeply to this moment in many, many ways.
Q, do you have anything you want to add to that
Well,
about kind of this context?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. That number one, the idea, right, and the truth of this idea that 60%, as Joel spoke to, 60% of the country was okay during the Depression. So who suffered the most, right? Folks of color, folks on the margin, poor people of all ethnicities. What is happening during this pandemic? Who's suffering the most? People of color, right? And poor people of all ethnicities. So it resonates with me and continues to resonate with me, the parallels there. You know, I led a racial healing workshop this morning for business folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And one of the things that I asked them, right, North Tulsa being where Greenwood, the historic Greenwood district, for folks who don't know Tulsa, was where Black Wall Street existed. Black economic vibrance for almost 2 decades before the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. And I asked folks if there was a stigma about North Tulsa today, that they feel like there's a stigma about North Tulsa, which is predominantly Black, predominantly African American. And folks told me yes, they did feel like, and I asked them why. What was that stigma based upon? And they said, you know, the idea of crime, Black folks, poverty. And I asked them, I said, do you think that stigma that exists today is in any way connected to the massacre of 1921? And they all said yes. There was no separation in a century. We are literally at a century. And there is no separation. There's not even a blip that's of a moment in the history of this city in which white folks did not or have not felt like North Tulsa was someplace they shouldn't be, that they were not welcome, that they were unsafe. That's a century in the city in which we live, fam. And that's Tulsa, Oklahoma. So then you can apply that to so many other places around the country that aren't even as progressive, not that Tulsa is very progressive, but aren't even as progressive as Tulsa, Oklahoma, and think, oh, it must be much, much more profound. And in Alma, Georgia, where the last image we're going to discuss, and the poem I'm going to read took place, occurred, I should say. And in Arkansas in the 30s, where hospitality, that poem and that image, where that image was taken. Are you kidding? If we're talking about a century of profound and entrenched racism and neglect exists here in 2021. And we're talking about images from 75, 80 years ago. Is that going to be, you think that the idea, the dynamics of race and economic identity politics were improved 80 years ago? No. So that's a part of why I think that this work is so important, because it does relate to today. The parallels to today, to this moment, are so profound. And if we weren't in a pandemic, they would still be as profound, right? Tulsa, Oklahoma, North Tulsa, I should say, is a food desert, right? There are many food deserts. There's a food desert in the Bay Area. There's food deserts in the Bay Area. There are food deserts on the south and west side of Chicago, where I used to live. There are healthcare deserts in this country. It's 2021, and we live in the most prosperous nation in the world. Why are there food deserts? Why is the mortality rate between North Tulsa and South Tulsa 11 years? Why is there an 11-year distinction? It's the same city, it's the same country. So we acknowledge, and I think that the beauty of what Joel has done with this work is acknowledging that hard and very, very difficult truth, and how relevant it sadly but importantly remains in this moment, how much it resonates still in this moment. Because that continuum, that tether, that what I say when I'm teaching class, the tenuous tether between yesterday and today, that tether ain't broken. That tether ain't changed. They ain't gone left. That tether ain't changed. It still exists.
Thank you, Q. I think that's very well stated. I was going to end with we got a few minutes left here, and I want to kind of set up to your final poem with the kind of a much more kind of an open-ended, profound question that would get us not a whole lot of anywhere, because I think you've already answered it. So in a lot of ways, I've been thinking, and I think this is maybe something that any of us in this field have struggled with a bit over this past year, is kind of like, why am I doing what am I doing? Does it make a difference? And I think, looking at this work and coming back to that, you can argue that's it's also propaganda. And it's definitely filtered through a group of small people, which we've talked about. And it raises all sorts of questions about truth. Who controls that truth? Who are the powerful people that do that? And I think we can look at examples just in the last couple of weeks that show that hasn't changed at all. And in some cases, it's gotten worse. And our platforms now are maybe more insidious, and they can actually get more into society and have more impact. When you can basically have a group on Reddit totally control the stock market for 24 hours, tells you a bit, right?
Yeah.
And we're in a very unique moment right now. And I think within this, that challenges is that, and the question I was going to ask, but I'm going to answer it myself, I'm going to transition here, is that how can art or poetry in this moment make a difference? And I think this work does make a difference. I think the work that both of you are doing does make a difference, because it's raising the right questions. It's slowing us down. It's making us think. It's making us challenge some of these things and ask that exact question that you just asked, you, is why hasn't these things changed? There's such obvious problems here. Why is this still a problem? Why are the have and the have-nots still here? And why are they gotten so much worse even in the last 12 months? And these are the right questions. And I think this is what art can do, is brings those questions out and then hopefully brings us to the point to do something about it. So with that, I would like to offer any closing words you have, and then like a transition cue into your final poem.
Well, I just want to reiterate that I'm honored to hang with you two fools every day. You should always surround yourself with folks smarter than yourself. And I try to do that. Why haven't things changed? Because it's about power. It's about authority. It's about control. It's about who controls the narrative. One of my early metaphors about Oklahoma, after I left but before I returned, right, is that Oklahoma for BIPOC people is there's a black man laying on the road, right, and there's a white man with a combat boot who is standing on his head with the boot on his head, and the white man says, "You can get up if you can move my boot from your head." And the black man, you can try, and succeed. You can try and fail, or you can just not try. And I see that as a metaphor for marginalized people in states like Oklahoma, right? That the boot is oppressive. It's on us. It's on top of us. Think about how Tulsa, even Oklahoma City doesn't enforce 187, but we do 187G. But Tulsa County does, right? We go into East Tulsa and lock up Latinx folks like every other day, right? But how do we change? The only way that we change the narrative, in a state like Oklahoma, which all counties voted red in every election, right? Every presidential election, is to do the work on the ground, to change minds, to open hearts and ideas. And it's literally one at a time in a place like Oklahoma. But is it worth doing? Hell, it's all we can do, because it's who we are. It's who we are. So it's all we can do, right? So that's how I feel about it. So
Joel, do you want to kind of respond to that and then maybe set up the image that goes with the final poem
Yeah.
and kind of set the stage for that?
I don't have much to say on top of that because that was so well said. But the one thing that I feel like this particular project is about, as far as the practical levels of that conversation, is I personally don't believe that we can fix anything without confronting what we've done already. And that is a really painful and complicated process. But this work is about that. It's about turning and saying, hey, this has happened and we can learn from this. Because I feel, to anyone who reads history, America is in this endless spiral. And as far as many questions go, it seems like until we admit and respond to and understand that history, there's not a lot to start with. It's the first step. As far as this particular show, it should be in Dasha's screen on the left. It's a portrait of a young African American man in a pine forest. So Q, take it from here.
In a pine forest in Alma, Georgia, where pine and wiregrass, and wiregrass were rampant. And I researched Alma, Georgia, and I found an incredible document from a historian from the 70s, a white historian in Alma, Georgia, recording all of this crazy real history of Alma, Georgia, which was just, Alma, Georgia was a part of the Confederacy, so you don't really need to know much more than that. But the poem is called Instinct. Piney woods country ain't no place to be poor and colored. Papa had 11 acres, then they come for the land. Make him so scared he buckled. Sold it so they can make paper up north. Razorbacks ate most crops, hateful pigs. Too bad them not like wiregrass. Be in before dark, else rude swine or nasty crackers come calling. We crouch at First African Church, praying both hogs leave us be. No look no white boy in the eye. Them say it disrespect. I say it my life, far as I see it. Not trying to be the next horned Negro that Dr. Dedge made of Joe Smith, showed him all over the place, goat horns on a full-grown nigger, wild man in a cage everybody see. Was wandering to the railroad station. These pecans get supper or be supper.
Thank you, Q. Thank you, Joel. I'm honored to share this screen with you this evening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dasha.
Thank you so much for those words, Garish. That was a really, it's something to read it and then there's something to hear you perform it. That's really, really special. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you to Scott for sharing your time and for leading the conversation, and Joel for sharing your work with us as always. We appreciate all of our panelists and everyone who joined us tonight. We are going to have this recording archived either on the 8 Bridges website or on ours. If you are interested in having it for something else, let us know. And hopefully we get to see everyone in the flesh soon. Yeah, Joel?
Just one quick plug. Q and I are going to be publishing a book with this collaboration. Timing unknown, but we would be remiss not to thank the Tulsa Artists Fellowship for grant funding that poetry collaboration, and we're bringing in other poets in addition to Q, who's leading the poetry side. It'll be a big old beautiful coffee table book with a bunch of poems. We just received a piece from Joy Harjo, the U.S. Poet Laureate, and it's a really powerful work. So we're excited about that. More news on that front soon. We're really excited to see where that goes.
It's very exciting. And if anyone would like to see the work that that last poetry piece was based off of, the link is in the chat as well too, if you want to zoom in and see some of the details of the walnut bag and the trees and all of that. It's really incredible. And then I think Ken also has the link to Croatia's upcoming book as well too, that he was going to pop in the chat as well. I'm really excited to see that one.
It's beautiful.
There it is. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us and being with us. And we appreciate your time and all of your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.